Warner Bros. Was once the crown jewel of Hollywood, the studio that gave us The Dark Knight, Harry Potter, Friends, and so much more. And for nearly a century, it struck a rare balance, achieving commercial success without compromising on bold creativity or cultural impact. The Warner Bros. Shield and HBO's static intro both became two of the most recognizable and trusted symbols in film and TV. But today, that same studio is unraveling, and the company is so deep in debt, it just announced it's splitting itself into two, which we'll talk about in a moment. But maybe worst of all, the people running the place are cashing out while the brand burns. And this is what happens on Wall Street today, when one of the most iconic movie studios in the world is just handed over to executives and investors who see art as a line item and legacy as something to be monetized, then discarded. And that's not to say that Warner Bros. Or HBO isn't still capable of making hits. They are, and they still do from time to time. But it's the likelihood of that continuing that seems in jeopardy here. So this is the story of how corporate greed ruined Warner Bros. In 2022, Warner Bros. Officially merged with Discovery, forming Warner Bros. Discovery in a deal worth over $40 billion. But since that merger, the company's stock price has been gutted by more than 60%. It's been a tumultuous 3 years marked by layoffs, executive shakeups, and a series of head-scratching, cost-cutting decisions. What was once pitched as a bold new media empire, blending Warner Bros. Prestige storytelling with Discovery's cable networks, quickly devolved into a debt-riddled mess. And here's why. Before the merger, Warner Bros. Was owned by AT&T, who had rebranded it as Time Warner. During AT&T's brief and baffling ownership, the company racked up massive amounts of debt, mostly from its own $85 billion acquisition of Time Warner in 2018. During that time, it failed to integrate media with telecom. So in 2022, when the companies merged, they inherited a lot of that debt. The newly merged company was suddenly saddled with over $40 billion in debt. Debt that required massive interest payments and placed a chokehold on long-term strategy. And instead of reinvesting in the legacy they inherited, Warner Bros. Discovery became obsessed with short-term savings, even if it meant cannibalizing the very content that built its brand. What that looked like over the years was the company bleeding billions of dollars. It meant scrapping fully completed films like Batgirl, not because it was bad, but because it was more valuable to WBD as a tax write-off. It meant gutting their streaming library, quietly deleting shows and movies to save on residual payments or storage costs, even if it meant erasing years of hard work and pissing off their subscribers. But it also meant spending millions on a baffling rebrand, dropping the name HBO Max, HBO, the one part of their business still associated with quality, in favor of a compelling name like Max. Also, they could merge the Discovery content onto HBO and I guess not have subscribers confused. That decision was not only mocked by the public, but it also ended up diluting their brand altogether. Earlier this year, they reversed course and changed it back to HBO Max, basically admitting the entire rebrand was a mistake. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any official numbers, but this embarrassing misstep likely cost them millions of dollars in consulting costs, ad revenue, and employee time. Now, all of these decisions didn't just happen in a vacuum. They were driven by one man, Warner Bros. Discovery's CEO, David Zaslav. And to be fair, he probably didn't make every single one of these decisions, but you know what they say when you're in charge, the buck stops with you. Zaslav was the CEO of Discovery before the two companies merged, and he had been in the media industry for decades. Since taking the reins in 2022, Zaslav has been nothing short of a disaster for the company. Because while Warner Bros. Is busy losing billions of dollars in value and in income every year, his personal compensation is quite staggering. In 2024, his exorbitant pay package barely squeaked through a shareholder vote. And by 2025, shareholders had had enough. They flat out rejected his exorbitant pay package, with nearly 60% voting against it. Now, to be clear, these votes are non-binding, meaning the board of directors who determines executives' compensation can still do what it wants. But it was very clear this was a public embarrassment, and under pressure, the board did end up responding by cutting his future compensation, albeit just slightly. But just to give some context on how egregious this pay was, in 2024, his total pay package was nearly $52 million. Now, compare that to Netflix's co-CEOs. who both made around $60 million each in 2024, which is no doubt ridiculous. But the difference here is Netflix made about $8.7 billion in profit that year, while Warner Bros. Discovery lost over $11 billion. In fact, Warner Bros. Discovery hasn't reported a positive net income since 2022 when the two companies merged. Over 3 years of losses. Now I know some people argue that these massive CEO pay packages can be misleading because they're not entirely cash. They're mostly made up of stock-based compensation tied to performance. And it's true that his base salary was relatively modest when compared to CEO pay at around $3 million. Most CEOs are paid this way to lower their tax burden, with the rest of the payment coming from either cash bonuses or stock-based options. But stock-based compensation still carries a cost. It dilutes existing shareholders, it adds pressure to hit short-term financial targets, and depending on the accounting method, often can get recorded as an expense on the income statement. So while it might not be a cash payment in the traditional sense, although some of it definitely is, it's absolutely not free. And when a company is losing billions of dollars, rewarding executives with tens of millions of dollars, while they're busy firing hundreds of employees, that sends a very clear message about priorities. And you've probably heard critiques around the idea of maximizing shareholder value before, screwing over anyone and everyone just to make the stock price go up a bit so the C-level execs can get paid more. Yeah, well, these executive-based pay structures are a huge component to this shareholder value illusion, and it plays right into this messed up system. According to the Wall Street Journal, his base pay will now be lower and some of the bonuses have been restructured. But even then, he could still earn tens of millions if the company hits certain financial targets, including successfully completing the planned corporate split. So while the optics have changed, the incentives really haven't. His rewards are still tied to financial benchmarks that encourage short-term decision-making. And that's been the pattern with Zaslav from the very beginning. Under his leadership, the company has experienced several missteps and has engaged in some serious cost-cutting measures, some of which make no sense at all. But he's done this at the expense of the very creators, content, and the legacy that made Warner Bros. A powerhouse in the first place. Recent surveys have shown morale has collapsed around Warner Bros. Discovery, but Zaslav has kept cashing checks. Now, to be fair, Warner Bros. Discovery has had some wins lately, especially at the box office. Sinners became a surprise breakout, grossing over $365 million globally, making it the third highest grossing horror movie of all time. And the recent Superman reboot under James Gunn has grossed over $400 million so far. It's on track to become the highest grossing superhero movie of the year, according to The Hollywood Reporter. The company still holds valuable IP across DC, Harry Potter, and beyond. But in an era where fewer people are going to the movies, box office hits can be extremely unpredictable. And the landscape has drastically changed over the last 10 years. Not just for studios like Warner Brothers, but for everyone involved in a movie or a TV show. Now, personally, I still think HBO is home to some of the best television ever made, both now and historically speaking. Some of my all-time favorite shows are on HBO. But let's be honest, that success has far more to do with the creatives behind the camera than with the executives managing the balance sheet. Generally speaking, great shows get made in spite of corporate leadership, not because of it. And meanwhile, Zaslav has been signaling that the real endgame is consolidation, positioning Warner Bros. Discovery as either a target or a partner for a future merger. The hope is that someone bigger like Apple or Amazon might come along and buy them out, or that they could strike another merger with potentially someone like Paramount to become a bigger fish in a shrinking pond. And that was part of the logic behind the company's recent decision to split itself in two, separating its declining linear cable networks that include CNN, Discovery, TNT, etc., from its studio and streaming operations. The official pitch is that, quote, this will also allow each company to pursue important investment opportunities and drive shareholder value. Now, I think many see it for what it really is. This is an attempt to isolate the liabilities and make the more appealing half easier to sell, that being the movie studio and streaming platform. This financial pressure had been building for a while though. Back in mid-2024, S&P Global downgraded WBD's credit rating to junk status, specifically citing the rapid decline of its broadcast business. And for anyone unfamiliar, that's essentially the corporate equivalent of a credit score in the 300s. The downgrade spooked investors because it signaled serious doubt that WBD could pay its existing debt, let alone take on new borrowing power, while still carrying both its legacy cable networks and its studio all under one roof. And that's a big part of why we're seeing this split happen right now. It has very little to do with driving shareholder value, and it's much more about managing optics so they can make the studio side of the business look more appealing to potential buyers. And at the end of the day, Warner Brothers isn't declining because people stop watching movies or caring about great television. It's declining because the people in charge treated one of Hollywood's most iconic studios like a distressed asset, something to be stripped for parts and offloaded. And I've barely touched on how badly industry sentiment has turned, especially after the way WBD has treated some of its talent. So maybe the split will buy them some time. Maybe a bigger tech company will swoop in and salvage what's left. But legacy isn't something you can just sell off and rebuild later. Once the trust is gone from creators or audiences, it's a long way back. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about why the $5 footlong ended up destroying Subway, well, I covered it in this video here. Be sure to check it out next. Thanks for watching.